The origins of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar originated in the early 12th century during the aftermath of the First Crusade, which had resulted in the capture of Jerusalem by Christian forces in 1099. In the years following this event, Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land faced considerable danger from bandits and hostile forces along the roads. In response to this situation, a French knight named Hugh de Payens, along with a small group of fellow knights, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem around 1119 with a proposal to form a religious military order dedicated to the protection of pilgrims. The king granted their request and provided them with quarters in a wing of the royal palace, which was situated on the Temple Mount, believed to be the site of the former Temple of Solomon. This association with the temple gave rise to the name Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, later shortened to the Knights Templar. The order combined monastic discipline with military service, requiring its members to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, similar to those taken by monks. The Templars were initially few in number and relied on donations to sustain their activities. Their legitimacy and popularity increased significantly after the Council of Troyes in 1129, where their rule, based on the Cistercian model, received formal endorsement from the Church, largely due to the support of Bernard of Clairvaux, a prominent abbot who provided theological justification for their existence. This endorsement allowed the Templars to grow in influence and resources across Christendom. They established a network of preceptories and commanderies in various regions of Europe, which functioned as administrative centres and sources of income through land management, donations, and banking operations. Although their primary mission remained military in nature, particularly in the defence of the Crusader states in the Levant, their financial activities became increasingly significant over time. The Templars developed efficient systems for transferring funds, safeguarding valuables, and offering credit to pilgrims and nobles, which contributed to their economic power. By the mid-12th century, the order had become a key military and financial institution within Christian Europe and the Crusader territories. They participated in major battles and held several fortresses in strategic locations. Despite their growing prominence, they remained subject to papal authority, and they were granted special privileges by various popes, including exemption from local laws and taxes, which further strengthened their autonomy. The order continued to operate with relative success until the late 13th century, when the political and military situation in the Holy Land began to deteriorate. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of effective Christian control in the region and signalled a decline in the Templars' military role. With their primary mission compromised, questions arose regarding their purpose and activities. Their considerable wealth and independence attracted suspicion and envy, particularly from secular rulers such as King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to the order. In 1307, the king ordered the arrest of many Templar members in France on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and other alleged crimes. Under pressure, some members confessed under torture, leading to further accusations and eventual suppression of the order. Pope Clement V, facing political pressure from the French crown, initiated an investigation and in 1312 formally dissolved the order through the papal bull Vox in Excelso. The Templar assets were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order, although much of the wealth was appropriated by secular authorities. The last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was executed in 1314 after retracting his earlier confession. The dissolution of the Knights Templar marked the end of a significant chapter in the history of the Crusades and medieval religious orders. Although the order ceased to exist officially, its legacy persisted in various legends and historical studies concerning its role in medieval society and its connections to broader developments in military, religious, and economic institutions during the Middle Ages. Hugh de Payens and the First 9 Knights. In the year 1119, a knight from the Champagne region of France named Hugh de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal to establish a new religious order dedicated to the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. The king approved this initiative, granting the knights quarters in a wing of the royal palace located on the Temple Mount, which was believed to stand on the site of the Temple of Solomon. This association led to the order becoming known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly referred to as the Knights Templar. Hugh de Payens became the first Grand Master of the order, and he was accompanied by 8 other knights. These men were Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payens de Montdidier, André de Montbard, Archambault de Saint-Aignan, Geoffrey Bizon, and 3 others whose identities are less clearly documented in surviving historical records. These 9 knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living a communal life modelled on monastic principles. Their stated mission was to provide protection for pilgrims on the dangerous roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem, though the limited number of knights initially available meant that their ability to carry out such duties was constrained. For the first several years of the order's existence, the knights lived in relative obscurity. They relied on donations and support from local clergy and nobility. Despite their small size and lack of resources, they were officially endorsed by the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Warmond of Picquigny, who provided spiritual authority to their cause. In 1127, Hugh de Payens travelled to Europe with the purpose of gaining support for the order. He visited France and England, appealing to nobility and clergy alike. His efforts resulted in increased donations of land, money, and equipment. He also sought and obtained the formal endorsement of the Church. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, the order received official recognition from the Catholic Church with the support of Bernard of Clairvaux, an influential Cistercian abbot who helped draft the Latin Rule, a code of conduct for the order modelled in part on the Rule of Saint Benedict. This document established guidelines for behaviour, governance, and religious observance within the order. Following its ecclesiastical approval, the order began to grow in membership and influence. Hugh de Payens continued to lead the organisation until his death, which is believed to have occurred around 1136. During his tenure as Grand Master, the Knights Templar expanded both in the Holy Land and throughout Europe. They received extensive donations from nobles and monarchs, which enabled the order to build a network of commanderies and fortifications. These early developments laid the foundation for what would become one of the most powerful and wealthy military orders of the medieval period. Despite their rise in prominence, the early years of the Templars remain partially obscured by the lack of contemporary documentation. Most of what is known comes from later chroniclers and official church records. The motivations and specific activities of the original 9 knights during the formative period of the order are not extensively detailed in primary sources. Nonetheless, the establishment of the Knights Templar under Hugh de Payens represents a significant development in the history of the Crusades and the militarization of religious life during the 12th century. The order's combination of martial and spiritual duties was relatively unprecedented at the time and would serve as a model for subsequent military orders. The legacy of Hugh de Payens and the first 9 knights would continue to shape both religious and military institutions in Europe and the Levant for nearly 2 centuries. Their role in the broader context of the Crusader states, the defense of pilgrimage routes, and the eventual financial and political entanglements of the Templars remains a subject of continued historical examination and academic interest. The rule of the Templars. The rule of the Templars, also known as the Latin Rule, was a code of conduct established to govern the lives of the members of the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It was formally approved at the Council of Troyes in 1129 and was largely composed with the assistance of Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot who played a significant role in the ecclesiastical endorsement of the order. The original text consisted of 72 clauses written in Latin and was later expanded into a much longer document as the order grew in size and complexity. The rule provided detailed instructions for every aspect of a Templar's life, including spiritual observance, personal behavior, military responsibilities, and communal living. The Templars were expected to live according to monastic principles, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were required to attend religious services regularly, maintain silence during meals and certain hours of the day, and follow a strict schedule of prayer and work. The rule forbade personal ownership of property, luxurious clothing, and excessive food or drink. Meals were to be simple and taken in common, with meat generally restricted to specific days. Dress was to be uniform and modest, typically consisting of a white mantle for knights and a black or brown habit for sergeants. The rule emphasized humility and discipline, discouraging vanity and disobedience. Military duties were integrated with spiritual obligations. Templars were instructed to fight without fear, but were also required to avoid unnecessary violence and to follow orders without question. The rule provided instructions on how to behave in battle, how to retreat if necessary, and how to treat captives. The master of the order held supreme authority, and all members were expected to submit to his commands. The chain of command was clearly defined, and all decisions were subject to the rule's stipulations. The rule also addressed the internal organization of the order, detailing the roles and responsibilities of various officials such as the seneschal, marshal, and draper. The rule stipulated how new members were to be received into the order. Prospective Templars underwent a thorough vetting process and were questioned about their intentions, personal history, and religious beliefs. Upon acceptance, they took solemn vows and agreed to abide by the rule for the rest of their lives. The rule prohibited members from leaving the order without permission and established penalties for those who disobeyed or abandoned their duties. Infractions were met with disciplinary measures that ranged from fasting and prayer to expulsion. The rule was later translated into French and expanded to include over 600 clauses, reflecting the growing administrative needs of the order and the increasing complexity of its operations. These additions covered financial management, the handling of donations, the operation of commanderies, and the construction and maintenance of fortresses. The rule adapted over time, but maintained its foundational principles of religious devotion, military service, and communal discipline. The Templars were unique in that they combined the monastic ideal with the responsibilities of armed knights. The rule reflected this dual nature by balancing religious obligations with martial regulations. Although the rule was strict, it also provided for the care of sick or wounded members and allowed for rest and recovery when needed. Templars who grew too old or infirm to serve in battle were often assigned to administrative or spiritual roles within the order. The rule of the Templars served as the primary document that guided the Order's operations throughout its existence. It created a structured environment in which all members were bound to a common standard of conduct. The clarity and rigidity of the rule contributed to the Templars' reputation for discipline and efficiency. Even after the suppression of the Order in the early 14th century, the rule remained a significant historical document, providing insight into the organization, beliefs, and practices of one of the most influential military orders of the medieval period. Life in the Temple. Daily routine of a Templar Knight. The daily routine of a Templar Knight was governed by strict discipline and uniformity, structured around the principles set forth in the Rule of the Templars. Each day was divided into fixed periods, designated for prayer, labor, meals, and rest, all conducted within a communal framework. The morning began early, often before sunrise, with the first of several prayers known as canonical hours. These prayers were held in the chapel or a designated oratory and were mandatory for all able members. After the initial prayer service, the knights engaged in routine tasks assigned by the master or senior officers. These duties varied according to location and circumstance, but often included care of weapons and armor, inspection of horses and equipment, training exercises, and preparation for possible military operations. The knights were expected to maintain readiness at all times, and physical conditioning was an essential part of their responsibilities. Training sessions might involve mounted drills, weapon practice, or tactical formations conducted under the supervision of experienced commanders. Following these morning tasks, the knights gathered for a communal meal. Breakfast was plain and consistent with their vow of poverty, typically consisting of bread, wine, and occasionally vegetables or legumes. Silence was observed during meals, and a reading from a religious text was often recited by a designated brother. After the meal, more prayers were offered, marking the next canonical hour. The midday period was occupied with additional work, either military in nature or related to the maintenance of the commandery. Some knights were tasked with administrative duties, overseeing landholdings, managing supplies, or assisting with correspondence. Others were involved in guarding pilgrims, supervising construction, or maintaining the Order's horses and stables. Every knight had a role to fulfill based on ability, rank, and the needs of the community. In the early afternoon, another prayer session was held, followed by a second modest meal. Meat was generally reserved for specific days, and only for those not under disciplinary restrictions. Food was prepared according to the customs of the Order, avoiding excess or indulgence. Again, silence and spiritual readings accompanied the meal. After eating, there was time allocated for contemplation, rest, or further duties, depending on the day's requirements. The late afternoon and evening hours included another sequence of prayers, further tasks if needed, and preparation for nightfall. Before retiring, the knights participated in the final prayers of the day. The sleeping arrangements were communal. Knights slept in dormitories on simple beds or pallets, fully dressed in case of emergency. They were expected to remain prepared to defend the commandery or engage in battle if called upon during the night. Silence was maintained in the dormitories and lights were minimal. Personal possessions were prohibited, and all items were issued by the Order and recorded in inventories. Days followed a predictable rhythm, with little variation except in cases of travel, battle, or religious observance. Holy days and feasts were acknowledged with additional prayers and slight adjustments in routine but remained solemn in tone. Discipline was enforced through supervision, regular inspections, and correction of any breaches in conduct. Those who violated rules faced penalties that included fasting, prayer, loss of privileges, or reassignment to lower tasks. Education in scripture and church doctrine was provided for those requiring instruction. While knights were trained warriors, they were also expected to live as monks, with humility, obedience, and devotion to God. Communication with the outside world was limited, and contact with family members was discouraged. The internal structure of the order ensured that all members remained focused on the collective mission, which was the defense of the Holy Land and the protection of Christian pilgrims. Every day reinforced the values of service, sacrifice, and religious duty. The life of a Templar knight was one of repetition, restraint, and routine, defined by a balance of martial readiness and spiritual discipline. The structure of daily life served to maintain order and unity within the brotherhood, ensuring that every member contributed to the overall function and stability of the order, according to established tradition and rule. The rise to power. Templars in the Crusades. The rise to power of the Knights Templar during the Crusades was a gradual process shaped by political support, religious endorsement, and military utility. Established in 1119 by Hugh de Payens and a small group of knights, the order began with the limited mission of protecting Christian pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land. Initially small and poorly resourced, the Templars gained significant recognition following the Council of Troyes in 1129, where they received official approval from the Catholic Church. This endorsement, aided by the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, allowed the order to expand its reach across Europe. Donations of land, money, and equipment flowed in from nobles and monarchs, enabling the order to establish a network of commanderies that supported operations in the East. The Templars were recognized not only for their religious dedication, but also for their ability to organize, fund, and conduct military campaigns. Their rule combined monastic discipline with military readiness, making them a valuable asset to the Crusader states. In the decades following their recognition, the Templars took part in various military engagements throughout the Levant. They participated in battles, guarded strategic locations, and constructed fortifications across key regions. Their presence was often concentrated in border areas where defense against Muslim forces was critical. Unlike other knights who served for limited periods, the Templars were full-time warriors with no personal claims to property or political office, which allowed them to act as a standing army under ecclesiastical authority. During the Second Crusade, which began in 1147, the Templars played a prominent role in supporting European armies as they moved through hostile territory. Their knowledge of local terrain, experience in warfare, and discipline made them an essential component of the crusading forces. Although the Second Crusade failed to achieve its primary objectives, the Templars maintained their position and continued to expand their operations. They managed numerous castles, controlled roads, and engaged in diplomatic and financial dealings on behalf of the Christian kingdoms. Their influence increased further during the Third Crusade, which began in 1189 following the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187. Templar forces supported the armies of Richard the Lionheart and other European rulers as they campaigned to retake key coastal cities. The order's logistical capacity proved crucial as they provided supplies, reinforcements, and secure bases of operation. Though the Crusaders did not recapture Jerusalem, the Templars remained deeply involved in maintaining Christian strongholds along the Mediterranean coast. Over time, the order amassed wealth through its European holdings, donations, and banking operations. Their financial services, including safe storage of assets and facilitation of transfers, attracted clients among nobles and royalty. This accumulation of economic power enabled them to sustain military efforts and fund construction projects in the east. The Templars held significant fortresses such as Safed, Tortosa, and Chateau Pellerin, which served both defensive and administrative functions. Their military presence and political connections gave them a central role in the defense of the Crusader states. They were involved in numerous campaigns, often fighting alongside or independently of secular forces. Their loyalty to the papacy and exemption from local laws enhanced their autonomy. By the beginning of the 13th century, the Templars had become one of the most powerful institutions associated with the Crusades. They maintained a large standing force, extensive property, and considerable influence in both religious and secular matters. Despite defeats and changing political conditions, they remained active throughout the later Crusades. Their rise to prominence was shaped by their ability to combine religious dedication with effective military and administrative functions. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. But the Templars continued to operate from Cyprus and Europe. Their reputation as defenders of Christendom remained intact, though their military relevance diminished in the absence of a Crusader foothold. The rise of the Templars during the Crusades reflected the changing nature of warfare, religion, and politics in medieval Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their structure, discipline, and adaptability allowed them to become a central force in the history of the crusading movement. Castles and Commanderies, Templar strongholds. The castles and commanderies of the Knights Templar served as the operational and logistical centers of the order throughout both the Holy Land and Europe. These structures were built to support the military, administrative, and economic functions of the Templars as they carried out their mission to protect pilgrims and defend Christian territories. Castles were primarily located in strategic positions across the Levant, while commanderies were spread across Western Europe. Castles in the Holy Land were often constructed on elevated ground or near important routes and settlements. These fortifications included strong defensive features such as thick walls, towers, gatehouses, moats, and inner keeps. Their design emphasized durability and functionality rather than ornamentation. The Templars maintained several key castles, including Safed, Tortosa, Bagras, and Chateau Pellerin. Each served as a regional headquarters for the Order's military operations and as a secure refuge for garrisons and local populations during periods of conflict. The castles were built using local materials and techniques adapted to regional conditions. They housed soldiers, chaplains, support staff, and occasionally civilians. Inside the castles there were chapels, storage rooms, stables, armories, kitchens, and sleeping quarters arranged according to practical needs. These sites enabled the Templars to respond quickly to threats, hold territory, and coordinate campaigns. They also functioned as points for gathering intelligence and conducting negotiations. The Order maintained a strict hierarchy within each castle, with the commander overseeing daily operations and ensuring adherence to the rule. In Europe, the commanderies served as administrative centers for the Templar estates and as recruitment and training sites for new members. These properties were granted to the Order through donations by nobles and monarchs and included farmland, mills, vineyards, and villages. Commanderies provided financial support to the operations in the Holy Land by collecting rents, managing agricultural production, and facilitating trade. They also stored weapons, food, and clothing for shipment to the east. Some commanderies housed knights and sergeants who trained recruits, cared for the sick, or performed administrative tasks. Others operated hostels for pilgrims or offered safe storage for valuables, functioning as early banking facilities. The commanderies were interconnected through a network that allowed for the efficient transfer of resources and information. Communication between castles and commanderies was conducted through messengers and written correspondence. This system enabled the Templars to maintain centralized control over a widely dispersed organization. The commanderies varied in size and importance, with larger sites managing multiple estates and smaller ones serving as local outposts. Each was governed by a preceptor, who was responsible for financial records, discipline, and the supervision of personnel. The income generated from European commanderies played a critical role in sustaining the Order's military operations. The architectural features of the commanderies were less fortified than those of castles, but still reflected the Order's focus on practicality and security. Buildings were usually enclosed within walls and included a chapel, residential quarters, storage facilities, and administrative offices. Construction followed standardized plans adapted to local conditions. The consistency in organization and layout contributed to the efficiency and cohesion of the Order. The combination of castles in the east and commanderies in the west allowed the Templars to maintain a continuous presence in both military and civilian spheres. This dual structure supported their long-term strategy of defending Christian interests in the Holy Land while ensuring economic stability in Europe. The castles served as frontline positions, while the commanderies provided the resources needed to sustain them. Over time, the infrastructure established by the Templars contributed to their influence and reputation. Their ability to build, maintain, and operate a network of strongholds was one of the key factors behind their prominence during the Crusading period. The legacy of these structures continues to be studied as evidence of the organizational capabilities and architectural knowledge of the Templar Order. Today, many of the castles and commanderies remain as ruins or preserved heritage sites, reflecting their historical significance in both regional defense and medieval logistics. The White Mantle and Red Cross, Templar Symbolism. The White Mantle and Red Cross of the Knights Templar served as the primary visual symbols of the Order and were closely associated with its identity, values, and mission. The adoption of the White Mantle was authorized by Pope Innocent II in the 1130s and became a mandatory garment for all Knight brothers within the Order. The color white was intended to represent purity, chastity, and the monastic aspect of the Templars' religious vocation. The Knights of the Order had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and their clothing was meant to reflect these commitments. The mantle was made of plain, unadorned wool and worn over the armor during military activities and over the tunic at other times. It was simple in design and free from decoration or personal embellishment. The Red Cross was later added to the mantle as a symbol of the Templars' willingness to shed blood in defense of the Christian faith. This Red Cross, typically in the form of a plain cross or a cross pate, was placed over the left shoulder or breast of the mantle and was a clear identifier on the battlefield. It distinguished Templars from other military orders and secular forces. The color red represented martyrdom and sacrifice, reflecting the Order's belief that dying in battle while fighting for the faith was spiritually meritorious. The cross itself served as a constant reminder of Christ's suffering and the religious justification for the Templars' military actions. The combination of the White Mantle and Red Cross became a recognizable feature of the Templar image and was seen throughout both the Holy Land and Europe. The wearing of this attire was regulated by the Rule of the Templars, which included detailed instructions on the materials, colors, and conditions under which it could be worn. Only Knight brothers were permitted to wear the white mantle with the Red Cross. Sergeants and other non-knightly members of the order wore black or brown mantles with a red cross, signifying a difference in status within the order while still maintaining visual unity. The distinction between colours was meant to reflect rank and function, not personal merit. The strict rules regarding attire reinforced the values of uniformity and humility. Personalization of garments or the use of luxurious fabrics was prohibited. Templars were expected to maintain their clothing in good condition and were issued replacements only when necessary. The visual symbolism of the mantle and cross extended beyond clothing. The red cross appeared on Templar banners, shields, and official documents. It marked buildings, graves, and seals associated with the order. The consistent use of these symbols helped to establish a strong collective identity and communicated the order's purpose to both allies and opponents. The presence of the Red Cross on Templar military equipment also served a practical function by enabling recognition during combat and coordinating movements in the field. The symbolic attire also carried theological meaning. It reminded members of their religious obligations and served to maintain discipline and focus. The wearing of the mantle and cross was considered a privilege reserved for those who had taken the solemn vows and were committed to the order's ideals. Removal of the mantle could be imposed as a punishment for violations of the rule, indicating a temporary or permanent loss of honor and status within the community. The symbolism associated with the Templars' dress played an important role in shaping public perceptions of the order. To contemporaries, the sight of a knight in a white mantle with a red cross signified a disciplined warrior devoted to God. It reinforced the notion that the Templars were both monks and soldiers, combining religious devotion with martial duty. Over time, the symbolism became part of the broader cultural memory of the Crusades and the medieval church. Even after the suppression of the order in the early 14th century, the image of the white mantle and red cross remained recognizable. It has since appeared in historical writings, artistic representations, and modern interpretations of medieval history. The enduring nature of this visual identity continues to reflect the order's significance within the context of religious military institutions. The Templars and the Holy Grail myth. The association between the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail is a development that emerged long after the order's foundation and suppression. During their active existence from the early 12th century to the early 14th century, there is no contemporary evidence indicating that the Templars were connected to any object identified as the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail, commonly understood in later literature as a sacred relic with miraculous properties, was introduced in medieval European literary texts rather than historical records. The concept of the Grail first appeared in the late 12th century in the work of Chrétien de Troyes, specifically in his unfinished romance Perceval, Le Comte de Grail. In this context, the Grail was a mysterious object featured in a narrative of chivalry and quest. Later writers expanded on this theme, introducing religious interpretations and linking the Grail to Christian traditions such as the Last Supper or the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Over time, the Grail became viewed by some as the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, or as the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion. These interpretations developed gradually through various literary sources, including works by Robert de Boron and the authors of the Vulgate cycle. The Templars were not included in the earliest Grail stories. However, in later versions, particularly in the 13th century Vulgate cycle and the subsequent post-Vulgate cycle, knights who resembled the Templars in appearance and conduct began to appear in Grail narratives. These literary knights were often depicted as guardians of sacred relics, defenders of the faith, and figures of spiritual discipline. These characteristics aligned with the public image of the Templars as religious warriors, which may have influenced the incorporation of Templar-like figures into the evolving Grail myth. The actual Templar order, however, did not claim possession of any such relic, nor did they feature the Grail in their official religious or military functions. The linkage between the Templars and the Grail became more prominent after the suppression of the order in 1312, following the arrest of its members in 1307 by King Philip IV of France. The sudden downfall of the Templars and the secrecy surrounding their internal practices led to speculation and myth-making in the centuries that followed. The lack of detailed public knowledge about the order's rituals and assets provided fertile ground for imaginative associations, including the idea that the Templars had discovered or protected the Holy Grail during their time in the Holy Land. This theory was popularized in later periods, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, through historical fiction, romantic literature, and speculative scholarship. Writers and theorists often combined elements of medieval legend, religious symbolism, and conspiracy theory to suggest that the Templars were entrusted with safeguarding secret knowledge or powerful relics. These ideas were further promoted by modern popular culture, including novels, films, and television series, in which the Templars were depicted as keepers of the Grail or as part of hidden traditions connected to early Christianity. Despite the widespread appeal of such stories, academic historians have found no verifiable evidence supporting a historical link between the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail. Most references to such connections are based on literary invention or modern reinterpretation rather than primary sources from the period in which the Templars operated. The Order's actual activities focused on military defense, administration of property, and religious observance. Their role in Christian society was defined by service, obedience to the papacy, and involvement in the Crusades. The idea that the Templars held secret knowledge or possessed sacred relics remains speculative and is not supported by the historical record. The myth of the Holy Grail and its association with the Templars is an example of how history and legend can become intertwined over time, producing enduring narratives that reflect cultural imagination rather than documented events. Templars at sea, naval prowess and trade. The maritime activities of the Knights Templar formed a lesser-known but important aspect of their operations during the medieval period. While primarily recognized for their military and religious functions, the Templars developed a presence at sea that supported their logistical, commercial, and strategic interests. Their involvement in naval matters was not intended to rival established maritime powers, but rather to facilitate the movement of personnel, supplies, and financial resources between Europe and the Holy Land. The Templars maintained ports and coastal facilities that enabled them to manage transportation across the Mediterranean. Key ports such as La Rochelle in western France, Acre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and Limassol in Cyprus were among the locations where the Order conducted maritime operations. These ports served as embarkation points for Crusaders, as well as receiving centres for goods transported from European commanderies to support the Crusader states. Ships operated or chartered by the Templars carried food, weapons, construction materials, and other necessary provisions. They also transported correspondence, money, and documents, all vital for the administration of the Order's widespread holdings. The Order did not maintain a formal navy in the way that later maritime states would, but they employed ships as required and developed a network of personnel capable of managing these activities. Their access to shipping lanes and port infrastructure allowed the Templars to exercise a degree of independence and flexibility in moving resources. In addition to logistical functions, the Templars engaged in commercial trade. They utilized their maritime connections to participate in the exchange of goods such as grain, wine, wool, textiles, and spices. Trade conducted through Templar ports generated income that was used to support their military campaigns and maintain their European and Levantine properties. The Templars also operated warehouses and storage facilities at major ports, where goods could be held before being redistributed. These activities required careful planning and record keeping, which the order managed through a system of clerks and financial officers. The profits from trade were directed towards sustaining the order's infrastructure, paying personnel, and funding fortifications in the Holy Land. Their maritime involvement extended to the protection of pilgrims. The Templars provided secure passage for individuals traveling to sacred sites, coordinating with other military orders and local authorities to minimize risks associated with sea travel. Ships used for this purpose were equipped to carry passengers, and arrangements were made to ensure food and safety during the voyage. In cases where piracy or hostile naval forces posed a threat, the Templars coordinated with Allied fleets to provide defense. Their presence at sea, while not dominant, contributed to the stability of Christian maritime activity in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Templars' access to ships and ports also enhanced their financial operations. They were involved in early forms of banking, and their maritime network allowed for the secure movement of funds across long distances. Wealth deposited in one commandery could be transferred to another location through a system of letters of credit, reducing the need to transport physical coin. This system was especially valuable for pilgrims and nobles participating in the Crusades, who relied on the Templars to manage their assets during extended absences. The maritime infrastructure of the order supported this system by ensuring that communication and transport between locations remained consistent and reliable. The suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century disrupted their maritime activities. Their ports and coastal properties were seized or transferred to other military orders, particularly the Knights Hospitaller. Records related to their naval operations are limited, and much of the knowledge about their maritime role has been reconstructed through administrative documents, charters, and accounts of trade. Despite the relative scarcity of detailed records, it is evident that the Templars' naval and commercial activities contributed to their broader mission. Their ability to operate across land and sea distinguished them as a highly organized institution capable of adapting to the demands of military, religious, and economic life during the medieval period. Their maritime presence, though not central to their identity, was a functional and necessary component of their overall operations. The Templar banking system. The Templar banking system developed gradually as a result of the order's widespread presence, administrative efficiency, and reputation for trustworthiness. Although the Knights Templar were established as a military and religious order, their growing involvement in financial transactions became an essential part of their operations during the 12th and 13th centuries. As the order expanded across Europe and the Holy Land, it acquired numerous properties, commanderies, and fortresses. These holdings required careful management, and the Templars developed a system of accounting and record-keeping to oversee their assets. Over time, they began to offer financial services that met the needs of both individuals and institutions. One of the most important functions of the Templar banking system was the safekeeping and transfer of funds. Wealthy pilgrims, nobles, and even monarchs deposited money with the Templars for security and convenience. The Order's international network allowed clients to deposit funds at one location and withdraw them at another, using written instructions or letters of credit. This practice reduced the risk associated with carrying large sums of money while traveling, particularly on pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land. The Templars guaranteed the value of these documents and maintained detailed records to ensure accuracy. They charged modest fees for their services, but their primary motivation remained the support of their military and religious mission. The Order's neutrality and close relationship with the papacy made them a trusted intermediary. They were often employed by kings and princes to manage taxes, pay ransoms, and handle other sensitive financial matters. Their role in state finance was particularly evident in England and France, where they operated treasuries, stored official records, and facilitated diplomatic transactions. In some cases, they served as bankers to royal households. The Temple in London, for example, functioned as a financial and administrative hub for the English crown. The Templars also issued loans to both secular and ecclesiastical clients. These loans were structured in ways that complied with church prohibitions against usury. Instead of charging interest directly, the Order would accept gifts or use financial mechanisms that generated revenue without violating canon law. Their financial dealings were recorded in ledgers and reviewed by appointed officials to maintain accountability. The Order's administrative structure supported this system through a hierarchy of officers responsible for financial oversight. Each commandery managed its own accounts, which were audited regularly. Revenues from rents, agricultural production, trade, and donations were recorded and forwarded to regional centres or the Order's headquarters. Surplus funds were often redirected to support military operations in the Holy Land or to maintain infrastructure across the network. The centralization of financial management contributed to the Order's stability and efficiency. The Templars' role in banking was not limited to Europe. In the Crusader states, they managed funds for local rulers, merchants, and religious institutions. Their fortified properties served as secure repositories for gold, silver, and documents. These sites enabled the Order to function as a financial bridge between East and West. Their ships carried funds and supplies between commanderies, and their clerks facilitated communication through written correspondence. The collapse of the Templar banking system followed the Order's suppression in the early 14th century. In 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of the Templars and the seizure of their assets. Accusations of heresy, though widely disputed, provided justification for the action. The financial independence and power of the Templars was seen as a threat by secular rulers. The papal dissolution of the Order in 1312 led to the redistribution of their properties and the end of their financial operations. Some of their functions were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, while others were absorbed into royal administrations. The records and documents that survived offer insight into the sophistication of the Templar banking system. Their practices influenced the development of later financial institutions in medieval Europe. Though they did not invent banking, the Templars contributed to its evolution by demonstrating how a religious order could manage and safeguard wealth on an international scale. Their system combined religious trust, administrative discipline, and logistical coordination. The legacy of the Templar banking system reflects their ability to adapt to the complex demands of medieval society while maintaining their foundational commitments. The fall of Acre and the loss of the Holy Land. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of Christian political and military presence in the Holy Land and represented the final loss of territory held by the Crusader states. Acre had served as the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem since the loss of the city of Jerusalem itself in 1187. It functioned as a key strategic and economic center, housing military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, as well as acting as a port of entry for supplies and pilgrims from Europe. The city's location on the Mediterranean coast allowed it to maintain maritime connections with the West and to serve as a stronghold against advancing Muslim forces. Over time, however, internal divisions among Christian factions, limited reinforcements from Europe, and the increasing strength of regional Muslim powers contributed to the weakening of the Crusader position. By the late 13th century, the Mamluk Sultanate, under the leadership of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, had emerged as the dominant Muslim power in the region and had successfully captured several remaining Crusader-held territories. In 1291, Khalil launched a major campaign to retake Acre. The siege began in April and involved coordinated attacks by Mamluk forces, including infantry, cavalry, and siege engines. The defenders included a mix of Templars, Hospitallers, other military orders, and secular forces from various European regions. Despite resistance, the defenders were outnumbered and lacked effective support from Western Europe. The city walls were breached in May, and fierce fighting occurred within the city. Civilians and non-combatants attempted to flee by sea, while many defenders were killed during the assault. The Templar fortress held out briefly after the rest of the city had fallen, but it too was eventually overrun. The loss of Acre was a decisive blow to the Crusader cause. It eliminated the last significant Christian-controlled urban center in the Levant and ended nearly 2 centuries of intermittent Frankish rule in the region. After Acre, remaining Christian outposts along the coast, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, were evacuated or destroyed to prevent their use by enemy forces. Military orders that had maintained a presence in the Holy Land, including the Templars, were forced to relocate their headquarters. The Templars moved their operations to Cyprus, where they maintained a limited presence and continued to manage their European estates. The strategic failure to reinforce and maintain Acre highlighted the decline of enthusiasm for crusading efforts in Europe. Political and economic priorities in Western Europe had shifted, and the willingness of monarchs and nobles to commit resources to the defense of distant territories had diminished. The papacy continued to call for new crusades, but these efforts lacked sufficient support and were largely ineffective. The loss of the Holy Land altered the mission of the military orders, which increasingly turned their attention to administrative duties and financial management. For the Knights Templar, the fall of Acre marked the beginning of a transitional period that eventually led to their suppression in 1312. Without a clear military role in the East, the justification for the order's continued independence and wealth was questioned by secular rulers, particularly in France. The fall of Acre also represented a turning point in the broader history of Christian-Muslim relations during the medieval period. It concluded the era of Crusader kingdoms and removed the direct political presence of Latin Christendom from the Eastern Mediterranean. Muslim control of the region remained intact, and subsequent interactions between Europe and the Middle East occurred through trade, diplomacy, and occasional military expeditions rather than territorial occupation. The memory of Acre and the Crusader states persisted in religious and cultural narratives in Europe. But the practical objective of restoring the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer pursued with significant effort. The fall of Acre thus marked the end of one historical phase and the beginning of a new period defined by different forms of engagement between Christian and Muslim powers. The envy of kings. political suspicion grows. As the influence and wealth of the Knights Templar expanded across Europe and the Holy Land, the order increasingly drew the attention of secular rulers. Originally founded as a religious and military organization to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Crusader states, the Templars had grown into a powerful institution with extensive landholdings, financial assets, and political autonomy. This growth was facilitated by privileges granted by the papacy, including exemption from local laws, freedom from taxation, and the right to operate independently of secular and ecclesiastical authorities. While these privileges supported the order's mission, they also created tension with monarchs who saw the Templars as operating beyond their control. Over time, political suspicion of the order began to increase. Kings and nobles became increasingly aware of the extent of Templar influence, particularly in financial matters. The order functioned as a de facto banking institution, offering services such as safekeeping of valuables, loans, and the transfer of funds across long distances. Monarchs, including those of England and France, used the Templars for treasury management and financial transactions. However, as the military function of the order declined following the loss of the Holy Land, the continued accumulation of wealth and property by the Templars became more difficult to justify in the eyes of secular rulers. The absence of a clear military role made the order appear less necessary, while its resources remained considerable. The situation in France was especially significant. King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, faced financial difficulties due to costly wars and domestic expenditures. He had previously clashed with the papacy over authority and taxation. His relationship with the Templars was shaped by both dependence and distrust. Although the Templars had provided financial services to the crown, their institutional independence and immunity from royal oversight made them a target of royal interest. By the early 14th century, Philip's suspicion had developed into active hostility. The fall of Acre in 1291 and the subsequent loss of the Crusader states had removed the primary justification for the Templars' existence as a military force. With their headquarters relocated to Cyprus and their European operations focused on estate management and financial affairs, public support for the order began to decline. The secrecy of the Templars' internal practices and their hierarchical structure further fueled rumors and speculation. Lacking transparency, the order was vulnerable to accusations that could not easily be refuted. In 1307, Philip IV ordered the arrest of the Templars in France, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. The charges brought against the order included heresy, idolatry, and moral corruption. These accusations were based largely on confessions obtained under torture and lacked credible evidence. Nonetheless, they were used to justify the seizure of Templar assets and the suppression of the order's activities in France. The political motivations behind the arrests were apparent to many observers, but the strength of the monarchy and the use of legal procedures gave the actions a formal appearance of legitimacy. Philip pressured Pope Clement V to sanction an official investigation. Although the Pope initially resisted, he eventually agreed to a papal inquiry. In 1312, under continued pressure from the French crown, Pope Clement officially dissolved the Knights Templar through the bull Vox in Excelso. The order's properties were largely transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though some were confiscated by secular authorities. The suppression of the Templars marked the culmination of a period of growing political suspicion and royal intervention. The order's fall was not the result of military defeat or internal collapse, but of external political forces seeking to undermine an autonomous and wealthy institution. The case of the Templars illustrates how religious and military organizations could become entangled in the ambitions of powerful monarchs. The envy of kings, combined with financial need and political opportunity, ultimately led to the destruction of one of the most influential institutions of the medieval period. The precedent set by these events demonstrated the limits of papal protection and the increasing authority of secular rulers in determining the fate of religious orders. The Friday, the 13th arrest. On the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, agents of King Philip IV of France carried out a coordinated mass arrest of members of the Knights Templar throughout the kingdom. The operation had been prepared in secret for several weeks and involved detailed instructions sent in sealed letters to regional officials, which were to be opened and executed simultaneously on the designated date. The arrests were conducted without prior warning and targeted all Templar properties and personnel within the jurisdiction of the French crown. The stated reasons for the arrests were allegations of heresy, blasphemy, and other serious religious and moral crimes. The charges included accusations of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, engaging in indecent rituals, and worshipping a mysterious idol. These accusations were based primarily on testimonies obtained under torture and on rumors that had circulated for some time about the secretive nature of the order's initiation ceremonies and internal customs. King Philip's motivations for ordering the arrests were influenced by political, financial, and personal considerations. He had long been in debt to the Templars due to his military campaigns and administrative expenditures. The wealth and autonomy of the order presented both a temptation and a perceived threat. By acting decisively and unilaterally, Philip aimed to eliminate the Templars as a political and financial entity within his realm while seizing their assets. The arrests included high-ranking officials, most notably the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, who was detained in Paris, along with other senior leaders of the order. Following their detention, the Templars were subjected to interrogation and, in many cases, physical coercion. Under duress, many of the accused confessed to the charges, although some later recanted. The use of torture as a method of extracting information was sanctioned by royal authorities and not initially challenged by the Church. The secrecy and speed of the operation limited the ability of the Templars to organize a defense or appeal to higher authority. The papacy, led by Pope Clement V, was caught off guard by the arrests. Although the Pope had previously expressed concerns about the order and had considered the possibility of reform, he had not authorized the mass arrests. Under pressure from King Philip, and faced with growing public scandal, Clement initiated a papal investigation into the charges. The Church held its own inquiries, which produced mixed results. In some regions, Templars were acquitted or received lenient treatment, while in France, the process remained under the strong influence of the Crown. The arrests on Friday the 13th did not immediately result in the formal dissolution of the order. That decision came several years later, in 1312, when Pope Clement V issued the Bull Vox in Excelso, officially suppressing the Knights Templar. The justification given was not a definitive ruling on the veracity of the charges, but rather the preservation of the Church's reputation and the prevention of further scandal. The order's remaining properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though many were appropriated by secular authorities. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was eventually executed in 1314 after retracting his earlier confession and maintaining the innocence of the order. His death marked the final act in the suppression of the Templars in France. The arrests that began on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, initiated a complex series of legal and political processes that concluded with the end of one of the most influential military orders of the medieval period. The scale, coordination, and secrecy of the operation reflected the authority of the monarchy and the vulnerability of religious institutions to secular intervention. The event later became associated in popular culture with superstitions surrounding Friday the 13th, although no contemporary sources at the time linked the date with bad luck. The historical significance of the arrests lies in their role in the dismantling of the Templar order and in the demonstration of shifting power dynamics between the Church and European monarchies during the early 14th century. Trials and torture. Confessions and Inquisition. Following the mass arrests of the Knights Templar in France on the 13th of October, 1307, a series of interrogations, trials, and inquisitorial proceedings were initiated under the direction of both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The process was marked by the widespread use of torture and other coercive methods to extract confessions from the accused. The initial interrogations were conducted by agents of King Philip IV and his legal officers, who sought to confirm charges of heresy, idolatry, and immoral conduct. These charges included accusations that Templar initiates denied Christ, spit on the cross, engaged in illicit behavior, and worshipped an idol referred to as Baphomet. The confessions obtained in the early stages were often contradictory, incomplete, or vague, but they were accepted as sufficient evidence to justify continued detention and further investigation. Torture was authorized by royal and local officials in order to compel admissions of guilt. Devices such as the rack, the strappado, and prolonged solitary confinement were used to produce confessions. Many Templars, under extreme physical and psychological pressure, admitted to the charges. Some later retracted their confessions when the torture ceased. In many cases, individuals stated that they had confessed only to escape suffering or under the belief that compliance would secure their release. Despite the inconsistencies in the testimonies, the confessions were compiled into formal records and used as the basis for subsequent trials. Pope Clement V, who had been unaware of the planned arrests, attempted to assert papal authority over the investigation. In 1308, he established a papal commission to examine the order and the validity of the accusations. This process took place alongside the ongoing proceedings conducted by the French crown. The Pope sought to bring the matter under ecclesiastical control, but his efforts were limited by the political influence of King Philip and the momentum of the already initiated legal actions. The papal inquiry gathered testimony from Templars in regions outside France, including England, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. In many of these areas, the accused were not subjected to torture, and their statements often denied the existence of heretical practices within the order. These testimonies contrasted sharply with the coerced confessions from France. Nevertheless, the political pressure from the French crown and the concern for preserving the Church's reputation led to continued proceedings. The inquisitorial process involved both individual and collective hearings. Templars were brought before panels of inquisitors and questioned according to established legal procedures. In some cases, those who refused to confess or who recanted previous admissions were declared relapsed heretics and subjected to punishment, including imprisonment or execution. The most notable example was the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, who initially confessed but later publicly retracted his statement. His retraction led to his condemnation and execution by burning in 1314, The trials revealed the extent to which judicial practices during the period relied on confession, regardless of how it was obtained. The use of torture was legally sanctioned under canon law in cases involving heresy, provided it was administered under controlled conditions and did not result in death or permanent injury. In practice, these guidelines were often disregarded. The inquisitorial proceedings against the Templars continued for several years and produced a vast body of documentation. These records were used by Pope Clement V to support his decision to suppress the order in 1312 through the papal bull Vox in Excelso. The suppression was justified on the grounds of scandal, division, and the perceived loss of the order's moral authority, rather than definitive proof of guilt. The trials and tortures of the Knights Templar illustrate the intersection of religious doctrine, legal procedure, and political expediency in medieval Europe. The reliance on coerced confessions and the influence of secular power shaped the outcome of the case and contributed to the permanent dissolution of the order. The events also had a lasting impact on the development of inquisitorial methods and the legal standards applied in cases of heresy and ecclesiastical discipline. The execution of Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was executed on the 18th of March, 1314, in Paris. His death marked the formal conclusion of the suppression of the Templar order in France. Born around the mid-13th century, Jacques de Molay had served as the head of the order since approximately 1292. During his tenure, the Templars experienced the loss of the Holy Land and a shift in their activities toward administration and financial management within Europe. Following the mass arrests of the Templars initiated by King Philip IV of France in October 1307, Jacques de Molay was taken into custody along with other high-ranking members of the order. He was subjected to a lengthy imprisonment and a series of interrogations during which confessions were extracted under duress. In an initial statement, de Molay acknowledged certain charges, although the circumstances surrounding this admission indicated the use of coercion and pressure. In the years that followed, papal and royal commissions continued to investigate the order. Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso in 1312, which officially dissolved the Knights Templar, citing the need to protect the Church from scandal. The order's properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in some regions they were appropriated by local authorities or monarchs. Jacques de Molay and other senior Templars were kept in custody as proceedings continued. In March 1314, de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, were summoned to hear their sentences. Both had previously confessed during earlier stages of the trials. On this occasion, however, they publicly retracted their confessions, declaring their innocence and affirming the integrity of the order. Their statements surprised the royal authorities, who had anticipated submission and acceptance of the court's judgment. The retractions were interpreted as acts of defiance and as a relapse into heresy under the definitions used by inquisitorial procedure. Under canon law, those who confessed to heresy and later recanted were considered relapsed heretics and subject to capital punishment without further trial. In response to the public declarations, King Philip IV ordered the immediate execution of both men. They were sentenced to death by burning, the standard penalty for relapsed heretics at that time. That same day, a pyre was constructed on a small island in the Seine River in Paris, located near the Ile de la Cité. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were led to the site and executed without delay. Contemporary sources report that both men maintained their innocence to the end and showed composure in the face of death. The execution was carried out swiftly and without a formal public ceremony. The event did not involve a final judgment from the papacy, but was instead enforced by secular authority under the justification of established inquisitorial rulings. The death of Jacques de Molay signaled the final act in the downfall of the Knights Templar in France. Although the order had been officially dissolved 2 years earlier, the execution of its highest leader represented the conclusion of its active presence. In other parts of Europe, remnants of the order had already been absorbed into other institutions or had disbanded. The case of Jacques de Molay remains a notable example of the use of religious and legal mechanisms for political ends. The methods employed during the trials, the reliance on confessions obtained through torture, and the influence of royal power over ecclesiastical proceedings reflected broader shifts in the balance between church and state in early 14th century Europe. The suppression of the Templars and the execution of their leaders did not result from military defeat or theological consensus, but from a convergence of political ambition, financial interest, and institutional vulnerability. The events surrounding the death of Jacques de Molay contributed to the lasting historical interest in the Templars and the continued examination of their legacy in religious, legal, and cultural contexts. The official dissolution of the Templars. The official dissolution of the Knights Templar was formalized by Pope Clement V through the issuance of the papal bull Vox in Excelso on the 22nd of March, 1312, during the Council of Vienne. The decision followed years of legal proceedings, interrogations, and political negotiations. The suppression of the order had been initiated in France in 1307, when King Philip IV ordered the arrest of all Templars within his realm. The charges brought against them included heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, and various forms of immoral conduct. Although many of these accusations lacked credible evidence and were based on confessions extracted under torture, they were sufficient to cause widespread suspicion. Pope Clement V initially attempted to maintain ecclesiastical control over the proceedings and launched a papal inquiry. However, under significant pressure from the French crown and concerned about maintaining unity within the Church, the Pope eventually accepted that the continuation of the order would lead to further scandal and division. The Council of Vienne was convened in 1311 to address the issue, among other matters. Delegates to the council discussed the status of the Templars at length. Although some members of the council believed that the order should be allowed to defend itself through a formal trial, others, particularly those influenced by French interests, argued that the damage to the Church's reputation justified the suppression of the order without a definitive legal judgment. Pope Clement V presented the matter as one requiring administrative rather than judicial resolution. On this basis, he declared the dissolution of the order not as a formal condemnation of guilt, but as a measure taken for the good of the Church. The bull Vox in Excelso stated that the order was suppressed by papal authority due to the serious allegations, public scandal, and the impossibility of restoring its reputation. The order's members were not universally condemned. Many were placed in monastic communities or allowed to live under supervision, depending on the outcome of local inquiries. In some regions, Templars were acquitted or given lenient treatment. However, in France, where the influence of King Philip IV remained strong, many were imprisoned and several were executed for heresy. The dissolution of the order involved the redistribution of its extensive properties and financial assets. A second papal bull, Ad Providam, issued in May 1312, transferred most of the Templars' holdings to the Knights Hospitaller. This military and religious order, also known as the Order of St. John, assumed responsibility for the former Templar properties, although the actual transfer was inconsistent across different regions. In some areas, secular rulers seized assets or delayed the process. The transition was managed through local ecclesiastical and royal officials, with varying degrees of oversight and accountability. The suppression of the Templars marked the end of a prominent religious and military institution that had operated for nearly 2 centuries. The order had been founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Crusader states. Over time, it had developed a network of commanderies, fortresses, and financial operations across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Its members followed a strict rule of life, combining monastic discipline with military service. By the end of the 13th century, following the fall of Acre and the loss of the Holy Land, the order's military function had diminished, leading to increased scrutiny of its wealth and independence. The official dissolution reflected the changing political and religious landscape of early 14th century Europe. It demonstrated the ability of secular rulers to influence ecclesiastical decisions and highlighted the limits of papal protection in the face of coordinated political pressure. Although the order was never formally declared heretical by the Church, its suppression effectively erased its legal and institutional presence. The legacy of the Knights Templar continued through historical records, local legends, and later interpretations. The formal dissolution in 1312 brought an end to the order's recognized existence, but did not remove its influence from cultural memory and historical inquiry, survivors, and secret legends. Following the official dissolution of the Knights Templar in 1312 by Pope Clement V through the Bull Vox in Excelso, the fate of the surviving members of the order varied depending on regional responses and local authorities. In many parts of Europe, former Templars were either absorbed into other religious institutions or allowed to live out their lives in retirement under ecclesiastical supervision. Some were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, while others were confined to monasteries. In regions such as England, Scotland, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the dissolution was implemented with less severity than in France. In these areas, many Templars were not subjected to harsh punishment and were permitted to retain a limited degree of freedom. The records show that no mass executions took place outside of France, and in several instances, local inquiries found insufficient evidence to convict the order of heresy. The response of secular rulers influenced how the suppression was carried out. In France, where the political campaign against the Templars had been most forceful, the monarchy exerted strong control over the process. In other kingdoms, the order's property was gradually absorbed into local structures, and surviving members were integrated into society in varying ways. Over time, accounts of the order's end gave rise to legends and speculative theories about secret survival. Some later narratives suggested that groups of Templars escaped persecution and continued to operate in secrecy. These accounts were not supported by contemporary sources, but developed over centuries through oral tradition, folklore, and later literary invention. The idea that the Templars had concealed treasure, sacred relics, or secret knowledge became a recurring theme in speculative writings. Such legends were particularly prominent in later European literature and were influenced by broader cultural interests in mystery and hidden history. The notion of a surviving Templar network was reinforced by the relative silence in some records regarding the final fate of certain members. This absence of information allowed for speculation that some individuals may have fled to remote regions or reorganized under different names. In Scotland, for example, traditions emerged suggesting that Templars had found refuge and contributed to local developments, although these claims remain unverified and are based on later interpretations. Similarly, connections were drawn between the Templars and other groups such as the Freemasons, though historical evidence does not support a direct link. These associations were primarily the product of 18th and 19th century theories that attempted to establish continuity between medieval military orders and modern fraternal organizations. Despite the lack of documentation confirming such connections, they persisted in popular culture. The idea of Templar survival also included stories of hidden manuscripts, underground vaults, and secret rituals preserved across generations. These elements were incorporated into modern fictional works and speculative histories that portrayed the Templars as custodians of esoteric traditions. While such narratives held appeal for audiences seeking intrigue and symbolic meaning, they did not align with established historical research. Most academic studies of the Templars focus on verifiable records from ecclesiastical archives, royal decrees, and contemporary chronicles. These sources do not indicate the existence of an organized Templar continuation following the dissolution. Nevertheless, the legend of Templar survival endured and expanded in the centuries that followed. It became part of a broader mythos that included other medieval and religious themes. The contrast between the documented suppression of the order and the later legends of secret continuity reflects a pattern seen in the reception of many historical subjects. As public memory diverges from scholarly consensus, symbolic interpretations often emerge that fill perceived gaps in the historical record. In the case of the Templars, this divergence has resulted in a dual legacy. On one hand, the historical order ended in the early 14th century, following formal dissolution by the Church. On the other hand, the idea of the Templars continued in legend, fiction, and popular speculation, creating an enduring image of mystery and hidden influence. Templar influence on Freemasonry. The idea of a historical connection between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry has been the subject of speculation, interpretation, and debate, particularly since the 18th century. The Knights Templar were a medieval military and religious order officially established in 1119 and dissolved by papal decree in 1312. Freemasonry, in its recognizable modern form, began to take shape in the early 18th century, emerging from earlier guild traditions of stonemasons and adopting a symbolic and fraternal character that spread across Europe and beyond. The chronological and institutional separation between the two organizations is supported by the historical record. There is no direct documentary evidence linking the operational structure, members, or purposes of the Templar Order with the origins of Freemasonry. However, beginning in the mid-18th century, some Masonic groups began to incorporate Templar themes, titles, and symbolism into their rituals and degrees. This development was especially prominent within the higher degrees of Freemasonry, including the so-called Templar degrees of the York Rite and other Masonic bodies. These additions were not based on verified historical continuity, but were rather symbolic adaptations created to enhance the ritual and mythological content of Masonic practices. The Romantic and Enlightenment periods fostered an increased interest in chivalry, secret knowledge, and mystical traditions. In this cultural context, the figure of the Templar Knight became a compelling symbol of loyalty, secrecy, and sacrifice. Masonic writers and ritual designers drew on these themes to enrich their own narratives and structures. The adoption of Templar motifs in Freemasonry was part of a broader tendency to integrate legendary and historical elements into fraternal ceremonies. It reflected an aspiration to connect modern organizations with perceived noble or ancient lineages, even when the historical basis for such connections was lacking. In some Masonic traditions, members of certain degrees take on the title of Knight Templar and participate in ceremonies that allude to the medieval order. These rituals typically focus on themes of morality, spiritual discipline, and symbolic resurrection rather than actual medieval history. While such practices create a ritual link between the Templars and Freemasonry, they do not establish a historical or institutional relationship. Academic historians generally regard the idea of direct descent from the Templars to the Freemasons as unfounded. The materials produced by Masonic bodies that suggest a continuous lineage are considered to be later inventions, created for symbolic or organizational purposes rather than historical accuracy. Nevertheless, the association between the two groups has persisted in popular imagination. It is reinforced by visual symbols, titles, and ceremonial practices that draw inspiration from medieval chivalry. The image of the Templar Knight as a guardian of sacred knowledge aligns with the Masonic emphasis on secrecy, allegory, and moral teaching. This symbolic alignment contributes to the perceived connection, even in the absence of evidence. Some writers outside the academic mainstream have promoted theories that claim an unbroken line of succession between the Templars and Freemasonry, suggesting that remnants of the order survived in secret and later re-emerged as Masonic lodges. These theories have not been substantiated by primary sources and are generally viewed as speculative or fictional. Despite this, they continue to influence literature, films, and conspiracy theories, further embedding the idea of a Templar-Freemason link in public consciousness. The enduring interest in this connection illustrates how historical figures and organizations can be reinterpreted and repurposed over time for various ideological, ceremonial, or cultural objectives. In conclusion, the influence of the Knights Templar on Freemasonry is best understood as symbolic and ritualistic, rather than historical or institutional. While elements of Templar imagery and legend have been incorporated into certain Masonic rites, there is no documented continuity between the two groups. The adoption of Templar themes within Freemasonry reflects broader cultural and symbolic interests rather than a direct line of descent. The persistence of this association in ritual, literature, and public belief underscores the capacity of historical symbols to be reimagined in new contexts across centuries. Templars in modern pop culture. The Knights Templar have become a recurring subject in modern popular culture, appearing in a variety of media including literature, film, television, and video games. This continued presence reflects a broad cultural interest in mystery, historical secrecy, and medieval symbolism. While the historical order was a medieval military and religious organization that was officially dissolved in the early 14th century, modern portrayals often diverge significantly from documented history. These representations typically emphasize themes such as hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and clandestine survival beyond the order's formal suppression. One of the earliest and most influential literary treatments of the Templars in modern times was found in the 19th century novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. In this work, the Templars were depicted as antagonists, contributing to the perception of the order as both powerful and morally ambiguous. This portrayal influenced later fictional representations. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Templars have appeared in a wide range of narratives. These include speculative fiction, thrillers, and historical dramas, in which the order is often linked to secret societies, ancient relics, or conspiracies involving religion and politics. A prominent example is the novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which includes references to the Templars within a broader narrative involving hidden history and religious mystery. Although the book is a work of fiction, it has contributed to widespread popular belief in the idea that the Templars guarded sacred artifacts or esoteric knowledge. Similar themes are found in films such as National Treasure, which associates the Templars with lost treasure hidden by secretive groups. In video games, the Templars frequently appear as central figures. In the Assassin's Creed series, they are depicted as a powerful and enduring organization involved in a centuries-long struggle for control over human history. This fictional portrayal draws on the myth of the Templars as a secretive order with a lasting influence beyond their historical demise. The depiction includes elements of historical settings and terminology, but presents a narrative that is designed primarily for entertainment. Television series and documentaries have also contributed to the modern image of the Templars. While some programs attempt to provide historical context, others focus on speculative theories and unverified claims, often blending fact with conjecture. These programs frequently explore alleged Templar connections to topics such as the Holy Grail, lost treasure, and the Freemasons. The repetition of these themes has helped to sustain public interest, even in the absence of supporting historical evidence. The enduring presence of the Templars in popular culture is not limited to Western media. Their image has been adapted in international works as well, including graphic novels, anime, and global cinema. In each case, the core themes remain similar, emphasizing mystery, legacy, and secret power. The Templars serve as a symbolic reference point for stories involving hidden truths and historical continuity. The influence of modern interpretations has shaped public perceptions of the Templars, often obscuring their original function as a medieval religious and military institution. While academic historians focus on documented activities such as the defense of the Crusader states, the operation of financial networks, and the internal structure of the order, popular culture frequently emphasizes unproven or fictional aspects. This contrast has led to a dual image of the Templars, one based on historical research and the other rooted in myth and entertainment. The persistence of the Templars in modern popular culture illustrates the broader appeal of medieval symbols in contemporary storytelling. Their visual identity, historical context, and abrupt downfall create a compelling narrative framework that continues to attract creative reinterpretation. Although these portrayals are often historically inaccurate, they demonstrate the capacity of cultural memory to transform and repurpose historical figures for modern audiences. The Templars' legacy in popular culture is therefore not a reflection of their actual history, but rather a product of evolving cultural interests and symbolic imagination. Legacy of the Templars, myth versus history. The legacy of the Knights Templar is shaped by a complex interplay between documented history and popular myth. The historical record presents the Templars as a medieval religious and military order founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Officially recognized by the Catholic Church in 1129, the order operated under a rule that combined monastic discipline with military service. Over nearly 2 centuries, the Templars built a network of commanderies, engaged in battles, constructed fortifications, and developed financial services that supported both their operations and the broader goals of the Latin Church. The order grew in influence and accumulated considerable wealth through donations, land holdings, and administrative efficiency. Following the loss of the Holy Land and the changing political climate in Europe, the Templars faced growing suspicion. In 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of Templar members within his kingdom, citing charges of heresy and moral corruption. These accusations, widely believed to be politically motivated, were supported by confessions obtained under torture. The papacy, under pressure from the French crown, dissolved the order in 1312 through the bull Vox in Excelso. The suppression of the order marked the end of its official existence, and many of its members were imprisoned, retired into other monastic institutions, or executed. In contrast to the historical narrative, myths surrounding the Templars began to emerge in the centuries following their dissolution. These myths often depict the order as the guardian of hidden knowledge, secret relics, or vast treasure. Such beliefs are not supported by contemporary sources from the medieval period. Instead, they reflect a later tendency to reinterpret the order's abrupt end and the limited availability of information about its inner workings. The combination of secrecy, wealth, and tragic downfall contributed to the creation of stories that attribute to the Templars a role in protecting the Holy Grail, preserving ancient wisdom, or influencing later secret societies. These ideas gained popularity particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, when a revival of interest in medieval history, mysticism, and romantic nationalism led to the inclusion of the Templars in speculative literature and symbolic interpretations. The emergence of modern Freemasonry also contributed to the association between the Templars and secret societies, though there is no verified institutional link between the two. The fictional association was reinforced by rituals, symbols, and terminology that borrowed selectively from Templar imagery. In modern popular culture, the Templars are frequently portrayed as central figures in narratives involving conspiracy, treasure, and esoteric traditions. These portrayals are commonly found in novels, films, television, and video games, where historical accuracy is often secondary to narrative appeal. Such representations contribute to a dual legacy, one grounded in archival evidence and another shaped by cultural reinterpretation. The historical Templars were an organized religious order with a specific mission and hierarchical structure. Their activities were documented by contemporary chroniclers, church authorities, and royal officials. These records provide detailed accounts of the order's establishment, operations, finances, and eventual suppression. The myths, by contrast, rely on gaps in the historical record and the appeal of secrecy and unresolved mystery. Despite their lack of foundation in documented history, these myths remain influential. They illustrate how historical institutions can acquire new meanings over time, often disconnected from their original context. The legacy of the Templars is therefore not confined to the Middle Ages, but continues to evolve in response to cultural, literary, and ideological developments. In academic circles, efforts have been made to clarify the historical role of the order and to separate fact from speculation. Nevertheless, the mythologized image of the Templars persists alongside scholarly analysis. This coexistence highlights the broader challenge of distinguishing between history and myth in public understanding. The legacy of the Templars, as shaped by both recorded history and enduring legend, reflects the complex ways in which past events are remembered, reinterpreted, and transmitted across generations.